Be prepared. Most people will wake up tomorrow completely unaware that something just locked into place for them. Tomorrow, March 14th, Mars will sit directly on top of the North Node in the night sky. And this is not one of those soft alignments that quietly drifts by. This is a hard redirect. Mars is the planet of raw movement, and the North Node has been called the destiny axis by astrologers for thousands of years. Now imagine what happens when the planet of action sits exactly on the point of direction. For most people, this might be meaningless, but for others, this alignment behaves very differently. Mars sitting on the North Node is extremely potent because it doesn't activate everything at once. It targets the areas of life that reveal who you really are when the pressure to perform disappears. For some people, this hits identity, the way you present yourself to the world and the version of yourself you've been holding back because blending in felt easier. For others, it hits independence. The urge to build something of your own, step into a path that actually belongs to you, or move away from environments that were never meant to be permanent. For others, it shows up in the body. Strength, discipline, reclaiming control over your energy and how you move through life. That's what Mars on the North Node does. It lights a fire under whatever part of your life has been stalled or quietly neglected for too long. But once that fire starts, something else always follows. Because this alignment is asking you to sacrifice something. Every genuine step toward a meaningful future requires leaving something behind. Not in a dramatic or destructive way, but in a very specific psychological way. Mars conjunct the North Node tends to expose the quiet story people tell themselves about why they are still waiting. Many people believe they are delaying action because of external conditions, but often the real reason is familiarity. Humans naturally stay in situations they already understand, even if those situations are limiting. The North Node represents the road that leads somewhere new, and new territory always feels slightly uncomfortable because it hasn't been fully explored yet. When Mars arrives here, that comfort with waiting begins to weaken. The energy becomes much more direct. Instead of endlessly analyzing the right moment, people start realizing that movement itself creates the moment. Destiny doesn't ask you to destroy your life. It asks you to outgrow the excuses keeping you still. What this alignment asks people to sacrifice is not security or stability. What it asks people to sacrifice is the explanation they've been using to delay movement. Once that explanation loses its power, forward motion becomes much easier. This alignment doesn't only influence individuals, the North Node also represents the direction humanity as a whole is slowly moving toward. So when Mars activates it, that energy tends to show up collectively as well. Mars brings urgency, impatience with stagnation, and a strong desire for movement. When that energy presses against the collective direction of growth, the atmosphere around people begins to change. You may notice it in conversations becoming more direct. People seem less tolerant of situations that keep them stuck. Decisions that once dragged on suddenly reach a conclusion. Even the general tone of the culture can feel more restless, as if people collectively want things to move forward instead of remaining in endless uncertainty. This doesn't necessarily mean chaos. More often it means acceleration. Mars energy pushes people to confront situations that have been sitting unresolved for too long. When momentum enters a culture, even small actions begin echoing loudly, Recognizing that atmosphere helps people work with the energy instead of getting caught in the tension it sometimes creates. Because when momentum builds collectively, it often reflects something that is also happening quietly inside individuals, the growing realization that standing still is no longer satisfying. One of the most noticeable effects of this kind of alignment is a simple realization. The place you are standing right now may not be where you are meant to remain. Situations that once felt stable begin to feel temporary. A routine, role, or environment that once seemed permanent suddenly looks more like a waiting room. This realization is usually very practical rather than emotional. People simply begin noticing that their current setup is not the final chapter of their story. Mars meeting the North Node represents movement pointing towards something ahead, and that awareness naturally shifts how people see their present circumstances. Once someone realizes forward exists, staying still begins to feel different. The comfort of familiarity loses some of its grip, and curiosity about the future begins to grow stronger. The moment you realize you're not stuck, the cage stops feeling comfortable. This quiet shift in perception is often where real change begins. Not with a dramatic decision, but with the simple understanding that the road ahead is real and that movement toward it is possible. And now, it's time for today's comment of the day. This is a short one, but it really makes a beautiful point. Never regret anything that made you smile. Life has a way of making us question the past. We look back and analyze decisions, relationships, moments, wondering if things should have gone differently. But this comment offers a gentler perspective. If something once brought genuine joy, laughter, or warmth into your life, then it had value, even if it didn't last forever. Even if the chapter eventually closed. Not everything meaningful is meant to stay. Some things are simply meant to be experienced. And sometimes, a memory that made you smile is already a gift. Thank you for sharing this reminder. One of the most interesting psychological effects of a Mars North Node alignment is the way it subtly changes how people experience the future. Normally, people imagine their goals and ambitions as something that belongs to a distant chapter of their life. They think about things they want to do someday, after they feel more prepared, after life becomes more stable, after they've figured everything out. In other words, the future usually sits comfortably far away. But when Mars activates the North Node, that sense of distance begins to collapse. The mind starts seeing things differently. Plans that once felt theoretical begin to look practical. Ideas that once seemed distant suddenly feel reachable. Something that once felt like a maybe years from now type of goal starts looking like something that could realistically begin much sooner. And what makes this shift fascinating is that nothing external necessarily has to change first. The environment might still look the same. Your routine might still look the same. But internally, the way you relate to time begins to change. Mars represents motion, and motion has a powerful effect on perception. When movement enters the picture, the future stops feeling like an abstract concept floating somewhere ahead. Instead, it starts looking like the next few steps on a path that already exists in front of you. Suddenly, the internal question changes. Instead of asking, "What if one day?" the mind starts asking, "What would the first step look like right now?" That shift alone can be incredibly motivating, because once the brain begins imagining real steps instead of distant outcomes, the entire goal stops feeling overwhelming. Instead of trying to mentally jump to the finish line, you begin focusing on the next action, the next adjustment, the next decision that moves things forward. This creates a very unique emotional atmosphere. Waiting begins to feel heavier than action, not because of pressure, but because the mind starts realizing that movement is actually simpler than endless anticipation. Delaying something that matters begins to feel less comfortable than simply trying. Even small steps begin to feel meaningful because small steps create momentum. And momentum has a fascinating psychological effect on people. Once someone begins moving in a direction that matters to them, their entire relationship with possibility starts changing. The future doesn't arrive when time passes, it arrives the moment you begin moving toward it. That idea sits right at the heart of Mars energy. Mars doesn't spend much time analyzing perfect timing. Mars focuses on engagement with life itself. It reminds people that clarity rarely appears before action. Most of the time, clarity appears because action started. Another pattern that often appears during moments of directional change is the sudden arrival of new people or unexpected interactions that subtly shift the way you think. It doesn't usually look mystical or dramatic. Most of the time it looks completely ordinary. A conversation, a suggestion, a passing comment that stays in your mind longer than you expected. Life rarely changes direction through events alone. More often, it changes direction through people. Someone introduces an idea you had never considered. Someone mentions an opportunity you didn't know existed. Someone asks you a question that forces you to rethink the way you've been approaching your life. Mars energy amplifies this dynamic because Mars represents interaction, movement between individuals, and the spark that happens when perspectives collide. When Mars sits on the North Node, conversations tend to carry more momentum. Discussions become more direct. Ideas travel faster between people. The environment becomes more active and more socially dynamic. That's why moments like this sometimes bring encounters that feel strangely well-timed. It might be a colleague sharing advice that shifts how you see your career. It might be a friend introducing you to a path you never thought about before. It might even be someone you meet briefly who says something simple that ends up changing the way you look at your next step. Your life can change the moment someone introduces you to a possibility you didn't know existed. Mars on the North Node creates the kind of atmosphere where those possibilities start appearing more often. Conversations become catalysts, ideas spread faster, people become mirrors that reveal options you hadn't seen yet. And what often begins as a simple interaction can quietly set the stage for a much bigger realization about where your life is actually heading. People often imagine growth as something that arrives gently. They picture inspiration appearing quietly, giving them time to think, plan, and move forward at their own pace. But real turning points rarely work like that. Many of the most important changes in life happen because something pushes us out of a place where we had become too comfortable. Mars represents that push. Mars energy doesn't spend time asking whether someone feels ready. It introduces momentum. It creates pressure that encourages action. When Mars meets the North Node, that pressure aligns perfectly with direction. Instead of random movement, the push begins pointing somewhere meaningful. This combination creates a moment where forward motion starts to feel natural. Not forced, not chaotic, but inevitable. The environment itself begins encouraging movement. Situations that once felt stable start shifting. Conversations become more direct. Opportunities begin appearing that require decisions rather than endless contemplation. Sometimes progress doesn't come from inspiration. Sometimes it comes from realizing you can't stay where you are. That realization is what Mars energy often triggers. It breaks inertia. It disrupts routines that have become too comfortable. It reminds people that their life is not meant to stay frozen in the same chapter forever. When this pressure meets the North Node, it becomes constructive rather than chaotic. The push has direction. The momentum has purpose. Instead of scattering energy everywhere, it begins guiding people toward a path that leads somewhere meaningful. And once movement begins, something fascinating happens. The world starts responding differently. Opportunities that once seemed invisible become easier to recognize. Conversations start leading somewhere. Ideas that once lived only in imagination begin turning into real plans. Destiny rarely arrives while you're waiting. It begins the moment you move. Mars sitting on the North Node symbolizes exactly that moment, the moment when motion and direction finally meet and the next chapter of someone's life begins to feel not just possible, but already underway. One of the most powerful symbols connected to the North Node has always been the idea of a crossroads. Not a dramatic, movie-like crossroads where someone stands in the middle of the road making a life or death decision, but the much more realistic crossroads that appear quietly inside everyday life. A crossroads is simply a moment where continuing exactly as you have been starts to feel less comfortable than choosing a direction. The North Node represents the road ahead. It represents growth, evolution, the direction that gradually expands who you are becoming. But on its own, the North Node is not forceful. It's more like a signpost pointing somewhere meaningful in the distance. People can spend years seeing that signpost without ever actually walking toward it. Mars changes that dynamic entirely. When Mars meets the North Node, the symbolism of the crossroads becomes much more intense because Mars represents movement. Mars is the instinct that says standing still is no longer satisfying. It introduces a subtle pressure that begins to make indecision feel heavier than commitment. Suddenly, the familiar road behind you and the unknown road ahead start feeling very different than they did before. The familiar road offers safety, it offers predictability, it offers the comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow will look like because it will look almost identical to yesterday. But that same familiarity can also begin to feel limiting when the mind starts recognizing that something larger might exist beyond it. The unknown road is different. It rarely offers immediate certainty. It doesn't come with guarantees, and it almost always requires stepping into territory that feels unfamiliar. But it carries something the familiar road cannot provide: expansion. When people imagine life-changing moments, they often picture something dramatic: a big announcement, a public breakthrough, a moment that everyone around them recognizes as significant. But if you look closely at how real transformation unfolds in human lives, you start to notice something very different. The most powerful changes almost never look dramatic from the outside. They happen quietly. Someone decides at 3 in the morning that they are no longer going to tolerate a version of life that feels too small for them. Someone writes a sentence in a journal that finally admits what they truly want. Someone stands in the shower, lost in thought, and suddenly realizes that they have been underestimating their own potential for years. Nobody sees those moments. There's no applause. There's no audience. But those quiet realizations often become the starting point for some of the most profound shifts a person can experience. Mars conjunct the North Node carries that exact kind of energy. It represents an internal revolution as much as an external one. While some people may take visible action in the days surrounding this alignment, many of the most meaningful changes will happen silently inside someone's mind. A decision forms, a belief changes, a new direction becomes undeniable. The interesting thing about internal revolutions is that they rarely announce themselves right away. From the outside, everything might appear exactly the same. The person still wakes up in the same place. They still go through the same routine. But something inside them has shifted, and once that shift happens, the way they interact with the world begins to change. And if you're still here, still watching, I genuinely want to thank you. Maybe this alignment sparks movement for you. Maybe it simply gives you a new perspective on where you're going next. Either way, moments like this remind us that life is always moving, always opening new directions even when we can't fully see them yet. So whatever tomorrow brings, step into it with confidence. Sometimes the smallest decision is the one that changes the direction of everything. And if this moment in the sky is pointing anywhere, it's pointing forward.